where philosophy matters.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Lloyd here. I'm doing a special stream here, especially for the Honest Teacher page. I'm doing this because we have a special guest, and I get to have a really good time today being able to talk about unschooling, peaceful parenting, and a bunch of other topics that are really near and dear to my heart and a lot of the work that I do, especially from my own experience, having worked with kids in a state school setting and as a juvenile defense lawyer, substitute teacher, tutor, company and so forth and so forth. So being able to talk to someone who has a lot of experience in this field, especially recent experience, is going to be pretty cool. So just to introduce you a little bit to her background, the guest we have today is Angela Harters, who is a certified teacher, best-selling author, and founder of PAX Ministries PMA. She left the public school classroom after over a decade in order to create a self-directed learning program for her children and others. She loves to inspire families to live with faith and freedom in every area of their lives. And her book, which we'll be talking a bit about today, Tales of a Toxic Teacher, Exposing the Cycles of Abuse Within Our Schools, shares the true story of some of the shocking experiences that happen behind the closed doors of a public school classroom. So welcome, Angela. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Jack. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So when you had messaged me online and you had noted your book, I was like, oh, okay, let me check this out, because I'm always looking to see what new resources and books are out there as more and more people are starting to exit the compulsory schooling paradigm and share their tales and say what's going on. I feel that personally, having done that, I always get excited to see when someone is doing something like that. So I picked up your book. I read it in just a couple of hours, actually, just an afternoon. And I was like, oh, okay, this is good. We got to talk about this and talk about your experiences. So I know I talked a little bit about your history and the generalities, but could you give everybody here a little bit more of the specifics, kind of a summary of your experience with education and how you came to be doing what you're doing?
Sure. I consider myself to be a lifelong learner, and we're always teaching and learning all the time. But I officially became a certified teacher in 2009. I was actually selected out of over 5,000 applicants. I was one of 10 that was selected to be in an alternative teacher certification program. So I started out teaching Spanish in a Title I school in one of the roughest districts in the country. After that, I got my master's degree in bilingual education, where I taught ESOL at an elementary school for a couple years. And then I had my daughter, kind of took a break from teaching because I wanted to be able to spend more time with her. And then I ended up moving back to Maryland and decided to get back into teaching again. And I got my certification as a special education teacher. Actually, prior to that, when I got back into the school system again, I started as a secretary in the main office. So that really gave me a unique perspective of working behind the scenes and what it's like kind of in the background of what's happening in public schools. And then from there, I was transferred to be a school financial specialist, which really was an eye-opener for me, seeing all of the financials and the way that schools manage their budgets and kind of the way money flows and how it's used in the public school system. And then after that, I started working with the special education students, got my certification in special ed. And that was kind of when I ended my career in the pandemic. The district that I was working for, they started requiring masks and vaccines for all teachers and were threatening firing teachers that were not complying with that. And I was the first to go. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So when it came to your experiences in school, you were working with children. What kind of started you down this path to question the nature of the role? Was there a specific thing that started to make you question what you were doing?
Absolutely. I think from the very beginning, when teachers go into the profession, no one goes into the profession of teaching to make a lot of money or to, be rich and famous. Like, we really go into this profession because we have a heart for children. We want to help them. A lot of us have this belief that we're going to change the world, and we go into it with kind of eyes wide open and hearts eager and arms open, ready to help and save everyone. And then when we get into the nitty gritty of it, we realize it's really not like what we were expecting it to be. And that's why most teachers actually leave the profession within the first 5 years, because we go into education thinking that it's going to be this amazing, beautiful experience where we're passing on knowledge to the next generation. And the reality is just not that.
So for me specifically, when I was in school, I'd already kind of had a sense that things were not right. I knew about how bad things really were behind the scenes, but getting into it firsthand myself, I noticed just how abusive the schooling practices were, and being able to watch students and how they react to different things, whether it's being shamed or having their stuff taken away because they're not on task or on topic, or just having to deal with all the state testing and constantly being under stress to prepare for that, and then taking hours and hours of testing. So what was it that really struck a chord with you in student behavior that really got you to see what the abusive nature of the schooling environment was?
Oh my goodness. Within the first 5 minutes of my very first day teaching, and I open up my book talking about this. But basically my first year teaching, my first 5 minutes, I was teaching, as I mentioned, in a pretty rough school. I had 30 desks in my classroom, and my smallest class size was 35 and my biggest was 42. And so the very first period, the bell rings and all these kids come flooding in. And I had a student that came in and decided he was going to sit on one of the chairs and prop his feet up nicely on the chair in front of him. And we were already short chairs. And so I politely asked him, hey, excuse me, can you put your feet down so someone else can sit here? And I mean, within a blink of an eye, he pushed the desk away and stood up. And I was 20 years old, a brand new teacher fresh out of college. And he was like a foot taller than me and just staring down at me. And he just was like, who the F are you to tell me what to do? And I don't have to listen to you, B. And I was like, whoa, like this was not what I was expecting. I've never interacted with teachers or seen anyone interact with a teacher in that way. And so that first 5 minutes was really shocking to me. And I was like, this is not what I had anticipated at all.
I mean, I definitely know that a bit firsthand. So my dad was actually an inner city school teacher in New York for about 30 years. And I got to see some of those rougher elements because he taught at, one of those rougher schools. And I was at a, private Christian school when I was growing up, but I got to go for when you bring your kid along to school day. So I got to see some of, those rougher elements where you have kids coming from all different types of walks of life, and there's gang activity, and there's, really broken homes, and just seeing that dynamic diversity of experiences where it's like there's many kids coming in who are just so broken and frustrated, and the last thing they need is to be like, you better do this homework or we're going to just label you a failure, right? So one of the things I like to help people really empathize with is thinking through what the schooling process actually does to the minds of young people in terms of the tactics that are going on. I thought that one of the really powerful things you had in your book was the power and control that wheel of violence, and you had an adaptation of that. Talking about a little bookmark there, the toxic teacher one. So with that kind of power wheel, could you elaborate a little bit about how the common tropes of abuse within a relationship, with adults and things like that, how there's a lot of parallels to that within how a teacher treats a young person in school?
Absolutely. And this was probably the biggest shift for me. I think early on in my career, it was easy to look at all the problems and say, oh, it's the students, or oh, it's the parents, or oh, it's the curriculum, or we don't have enough money. But when I learned about the power and control wheel, that was when I really had to shift my view and say, wait a second, no, it's not all of these other things. I am contributing to this major problem. And I just couldn't be a part of it anymore. But the way I discovered the power and control wheel was actually, I was in an abusive marriage at the time, and a friend had shared with me the power and control wheel of domestic violence. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, it has power and control at the center of the wheel. And then there are 8 different aspects of power and control. They have force and threats, coercion, manipulation, isolation. Yeah, he's sharing it there on the screen for you. Using children, blaming, shaming, all these different aspects of power and control that contribute to abusive environments. And so I was learning about this power and control wheel, thinking about it in the context of my marriage at the time. But as I was reading each of these details, I was like, wait a second, this is what we do every day in the classroom. This is what we do every day in public school. And it was one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, kind of a thing, And so that was when I really started seeing those parallels. And every day I would go into school and say, wait a second, that's coercion. And wait a minute, that's force and humiliation. And I couldn't unsee it. And I eventually got to the point that I couldn't be a part of that anymore in good conscience, because the whole system of itself of, I'm a teacher and I'm going to sit down and make you sit here for 8 hours a day. And I'm going to tell you what to do, what not to do, when you can speak, when you can pee, when you can eat, literally controlling every aspect of a child's being, regardless of their unique gifts and talents, regardless of their passions. And if you don't, I'm going to threaten you, and I'm going to humiliate you, and I'm going to coerce you, and I'm going to call your parents, and you're going to have detention, and we're going to give you a, naughty check or whatever. You're going to sit in the naughty corner, and we're going to humiliate you with this behavior chart in the front of the room so everyone knows you're the bad kid. And it just, all these things that are so common practice in teaching, the whole system is inherently toxic and abusive, and it's time for us to do something drastically different. We cannot reform the system. We need to completely throw it away.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I completely agree with you there. I think a lot of the times that people are trying to analyze the social situations, what's happening in school, it can be hard for them to think through it empathetically. I think the trauma sometimes is so great that when people try to reflect back on what their experiences were, they kind of have, rosy hindsight glasses, and they miss the actual social interactions that got them to feel shame and to conform and to obey whatever a teacher said, through what often is, of course, gaslighting. I think you bring that up in your book, which is that teachers, in order to keep students from continue to question things, have to tell them sweet lies in order to have a child discount their interests or discount their alternative learning, whatever they'd like to do. And so, that's just kind of this thing that gets glossed over in the process, is not realizing that with these little kids, the teachers are constantly using shaming and control tactics, and telling them, oh, well, this isn't important right now. Oh, you need to do this. And it's like, well, why? But it's like, they can't give an honest answer about the nature of the schooling system and the laws and everything else, because if they were to do that, then it would open up all these more questions about what it is that, that's going on and why they have to do this. And then of course it comes back to, well, because I said so, right?
Literally no other reason besides, I think arbitrary is the word I would use. It truly is arbitrary. And once I realized the power and control, I just started thinking, again, asking that question, why are we doing this? And around the time that I started questioning these things, I read John Taylor Gatto's book, which was really helpful in giving me just another teacher's perspective on this. Like, hey, I'm not the only teacher that sees all these problems. And then at the time I was teaching Algebra 2. And that for me was like so mind-blowing, because I remember sitting there and we spent, several weeks trying to teach these kids how to graph a quadratic function. And I just remember thinking, this is such a waste of time. I have not done this in 15 years. These kids will probably never do this ever again in their lives. Why am I taking so much precious time from their lives to do something that has no value for them? And it just, again, it comes back to that, just like you said, just because I said so. And that's it. Like, there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no logic behind it, just because I said. And then who said? That's the other question. Who says?
Right. I'm really glad you brought up the math component, because it's not that math isn't useful. And I think people often, complain or kind of make a false comparison there, where they say, oh, well, you just want these kids to be stupid and dumb and not understand math in the world. It's like, no, it's like learning about thinking skills and about the world isn't only found in mathematics. Mathematics is, of course, an incredible and important field of knowledge to be able to actually work with the world and make things, machined right in terms of technology and stuff like that. But the idea that everyone must learn this particular thing at this particular time and in this particular progression, that must be uniform for everybody is just really the silly, nonsensical idea. You know what I mean? It's one of those things that people just take for granted and think, oh, well, if they don't do this now, they're just going to never be able to do math or understand anything about the world, despite forgetting about it a couple weeks later after they crammed it for the test. You know what I mean? And I feel that myself, because I was a teacher for those types of topics, honors geometry, other things like that. And it's like, yeah, even I would forget certain things and just have to go re-look it up and just recall the steps in the process, just like anybody else who doesn't have every piece of knowledge stored in their head. So I'm glad you brought that aspect up to, just remind people of that fact. So one of the things I think that you bring together well in your book is, or are the specifics of how the process of getting kids to conform to the classroom, specifically is really about, controlling kids and getting them to a certain, preconceived outcome of what it is that they should be doing for their lives. And especially I'd like this framing: the isolation disrupts human connection. So could you talk a little bit about the concepts of isolation, and both in terms of just how students are isolated and being punished, and also the isolation of knowledge, and in terms of learning and how things are broken up?
Yeah, absolutely. Isolation is one of those things that I think in our society we've just become so used to that. And for me, that started with parenting, right? As a parent, we're taught, if your kid's bad, you just stick them in timeout. We just isolate them. But as you do research into these kinds of tactics, one, isolation is an abusive tactic. And if we're using it in a punitive way, it really creates a lot of harm for children. It's damaging for their brains. It's damaging for their body because their body goes into stress mode. So it really causes a lot of problems. So in the punitive way, when a child is bad, we isolate them, whether by putting them in a naughty corner or giving them detention or making them stay after school, restricting their access to recess or different activities that other children are participating in. So that, of course, is harmful. But then when you look even at the deeper level of these children aren't just isolated when they're bad. All of the children that are in a public school environment are isolated from the rest of society. They're confined to these four walls, and it's really a shame because so much of human growth and development, especially development and empathy, comes from being able to interact with people of different ages, different backgrounds, different cultures. And kids at school really miss out on that, which is one of the reasons why when I was a teacher, I made a commitment to take my children out of the classroom at least once a quarter. It was very difficult to do, all the hoops to jump through, to set up a field trip and all of those kinds of things. But it's worth it because children, the best learning that we can do is the learning that we do in real life with real people in real circumstances. That's the learning that really lasts, and it's the learning that makes the biggest impact.
Yeah, I agree there wholeheartedly that this idea of taking kids and divorcing them from the real world and isolating them into groups of just similarly aged people ends up creating this type of I guess you could say, a bullying and hierarchy structure. I think you also talk about that in your book with upperclassmen, lowerclassmen, and how things are segregated based on honors and regulars and pitting kids against each other for teachers' attention and awards and things like that. That all these different types of isolation tactics that artificially pit kids against each other instead of just having them be collaborative with a host of different types of people, being able to learn from the young and the old and everybody in between, really sets young people up to fail, because it's so separated from reality of what they have to deal with when they actually start to work in the regular outside school world, where they're going to have to deal with all different types of people, whether it's they're being entrepreneurs or working for somebody else. You're going to likely end up working with and dealing with all different types of people. So I definitely agree there that isolation really can hurt a child's both social and intellectual growth in the process. So absolutely. One of the things that I think is unique to your writing here, and you were touching a little bit about that, is the psychological aspects of schooling and how those different types of behaviors by teachers to isolate, shame, and control kids really can affect them. Could you touch a little bit about the social environment in terms of the shaming and isolation complexes, stuff like that kids get because of how they are controlled within their peer group, like talking about teachers and how they use children for the sake of shaming or getting things done to control kids?
Yeah. So one of the most powerful books that I've read on this topic is Alfie Kohn's book, Punished by Rewards. And that book, he goes into great depth about the psychological impact of essentially bribing children and coercing children to do certain things. And again, it's not just the punitive aspects of when a kid is bad that we're going to do these punitive things that we know cause harm, but it's also the flip side, the bribes, right? That I'm going to incentivize you and you got to do this XYZ in order to get this A, or do this in order to get this sticker. And when we start doing that with children, it just completely destroys their intrinsic motivation. And if we think about our goal as teachers, we want to cultivate lifelong learners. As a mom, I want my child not just to learn things, but I want her to really love learning. And you can't make a child love learning as long as you are forcing and coercing them and humiliating them and bribing them to do these things. There are hundreds of scientific studies that show the harm of doing just that. And yet, every single day in public school classrooms all over the world, that's exactly what we're doing, even though we know that it causes harm.
Right. Yeah. I mean, whether it's just, getting a specific award, like a certain, end of year award for highest grade, or, getting something for being more obedient that day, a candy or something like that, or just grades, like trying to get A, whatever it is, there's a lot of this social pressure and stigmatization to conform for the sake of getting recognition, special time, special privileges, and so on and so forth. So absolutely. I mean, there's just so many different ways that, there's social pressures put on kids to get them to conform.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think, I've seen personally, and I think you might be able to speak to this too on a broad level, having, taught all the way across young kids to older kids, is seeing the mocking and shaming being done to certain children to get others to comply. And for me, like that's one of the most powerful aspects of this social paradigm is that by picking on, one kid or two kids to make examples of, others then get afraid and then become more, compliant with whatever the teacher's doing. So could you speak a little bit to that, especially with the younger kids demographic of, how those types of things would go about and what responses would happen thereafter with those types of shaming or control tactics?
Yes. One of the most terrible things that I actually had another teacher share with me was that in her school, they made all of the second graders, again, these are second graders, that means they're 7 years old, 7 years old, made all of the white second graders apologize to all of the other students of color for their white privilege.
Wow.
Yeah, in second grade.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did break that up, because that is something that I speak out against too. Is the CRT topics? For those who don't know, critical race theory topics, because that specifically is a shaming tactic, all or nothing thinking. You're either all good or all bad. You're all racist. You're all not. Based on these criteria, and that's pretty incredible that you had that experience, like in those schools, seeing some of this manifest. I did not get to see that. I exited that school in Paradigm about 2016, and at least the schools that I was at, it wasn't really that much of a thing yet. In terms of specifically CRT materials. So could you elaborate a little bit more about that from your own experiences, about how that's being used to like pick kids against each other and to create more social strife?
Absolutely. I think, I've been teaching for over 12 years, and kind of at the beginning of my career, I didn't see it as often, but definitely within the last decade, I've seen a huge shift where they're starting to really push this agenda of racism and white privilege, and it's causing so much division in the classroom. It's causing division amongst students. I'm kind of seeing now where there's a lot of my African American students in particular are expressing hatred towards white people. I've seen that happen multiple times as well, where, by a lot of them think that I'm Hispanic because I taught Spanish. And so they would make comments to me about white people and how they hate white people. And I was like, well, actually, I'm white. And they're, oh, I'm sorry, Miss Harders, I didn't know. But yeah, I'm definitely seeing a very clear divide that's just continuing to be pushed on the children, and not just with the children, but also with the staff members too. I find that the staff members as well are feeling bullied and forced to comply with a lot of these things, especially like transgender things and the pronouns. I know that's been a big issue in a lot of the schools. For me personally, my school had us all of the teachers, we had to write a paper showing how our white privilege was harming our students. And that was something that they had the students also discussing about how white privilege was harming them. They started doing like they call them social emotional lessons. But really it's just, again, perpetuating a lot of those myths and ideas that are so extremely divisive. And it's a shame. It's devastating.
Yeah, it is really devastating, and even that has, I think, in many cases, afflicted unschooling groups and centers. I think that for example, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education was taken over by CRT people who I think completely, ran that organization to the ground. And the reason why it's so destructive to me is that while you can definitely look at the history of violence, slavery, oppression, and laws and things that affect people even to this day, because there's tons of that. That doesn't mean that every single person is also a part of that past. And that's, to me, the most horrific thing that you can do to a child is to try to say that they are responsible, this innocent, new human being who hasn't done anything to anybody, that they're somehow responsible for the past harms of other people, and that they're inherently biased, bigoted, and things like that, even though they're, just a little kid exploring the world, just trying to absorb everything like everybody else. And so to me, it's very regressive, because it's collectivism, which is, assigning to people, based on superficial characteristics and groupings, guilt or responsibility, and punishing them instead of, the individual. What did the individual do? And to me, that, that's been something I've also tried to push back, against, not just talk about, what's happening in the mainstream schools, but also in some unschooling groups or advocacy, you could say, centers and not-for-profits, where it's been tainted a lot by that. And they're essentially reintroducing curriculum, also. It's actually them trying to you have to learn about these specific past harms. I'm like, but wait, aren't you now saying that you're forcing kids to, have to learn a specific thing now? Like, you need to learn this, particular lens of analyzing history now. And so
I totally agree that there's so much value in being able to look at the contributions of people of all different races and cultural backgrounds and all of these things. And at the same time, I also acknowledge there's just no way that any person can know all of the things that there is to know about history, all the complexities, all the intricacies, especially because history was written by the winners, right? So there's a big aspect of that as well, that there's some stuff that we just will never know. But at the end of the day, I think the more that we perpetuate these myths of being able to blame other groups of people for the problems in my life, rather than being able to encourage every child, you are a unique individual, and again, you have control over yourself. Like, you can't control what anyone else around you thinks. You're responsible for you. Who do you want to be in the world? What do you want to contribute to the world? And having children focus on that, on who they are as individuals, rather than blaming everything and everyone else around them for the problems that society in general is experiencing, I think we'll get a lot further with children in general if we can encourage them to take responsibility for themselves.
Right. And on that note, your book also does cover the changes in behavior as to parents and children that start to foster this, you call it world schooling mindset. And I think that there's some topics that underpin that, with peaceful parenting and certain types of communication styles, that move away from the coercive schooling environment. Could you talk a little bit about what it is that you advocate for in that more peaceful model, and how that starts to show a change over in world schooling, or some I know as unschooling, things like that, self-directed education, how that paradigm starts to shift?
Absolutely. So I started out with peaceful parenting, learning about peaceful parenting. Of course, I was not raised with that kind of philosophy that again, the peaceful parenting philosophy says that children are humans too, and they are just as worthy of respect and kindness and grace just as much as me, that their opinions and feelings are just as valid as mine. And taking a posture of, this is a unique individual that God has given me to raise. How can I help nurture them in their gifts and their talents, and do so in a way that I'm modeling for them the kind of behavior that I want to see? So if I want my child to be kind, I'm going to demonstrate kindness to them. If I want my child to be respectful, I'm going to treat them with respect. If I want my child to be a critical thinker and great at making decisions, I have to give them opportunities to make their own decisions. And so when my daughter was 5, that was when I really started thinking, okay, how do I apply these principles? That I'm not going to treat you with punishments and rewards. I'm not going to bribe or threaten you. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to humiliate you. I'm not going to hit you if you don't do what I want you to do. I'm not going to do these things. how do I apply these same principles when it comes to your education? And that was when the whole world of unschooling kind of opened up for me. I personally am not a fan of the term unschooling because I think it kind of puts people off a little bit, and it communicates kind of what we're not doing rather than what we're standing for. So I prefer the term lifelong learners, self-directed learners, or the term that I coined, which is peaceful world schoolers. And so peaceful world schooling, that philosophy says that we view the entire world as our classroom and all of the people and places in it as our greatest teachers. And it really helps us to step outside of this schooling box that learning has to look like this. It has to be done in this way, in this order, in this time, in this place. And we can really begin to view all of life as learning and all learning as valuable.
Yeah, I really like that encapsulation. I think that is a big part of that paradigm shift is, and what's probably one of the toughest things for people that I often joke with them about is that, they'll say, oh, well, how are they supposed to learn anything? And I say, well, first off, did you stop learning the second you stepped outside of a classroom? Like, is that, it's like, oh, there it is. No more information came into my head. I didn't learn any other skills, never learned how to do anything, never learned how to play a game or drive somewhere or do it, So it's kind of silly because everybody who has, at least this functioning brain, they're not, in a vegetative state, knows that after you leave school, you still learn stuff about the world. You still learn new information. You still learn new skills. You can still take, whatever ad hoc classes you want, whether it's an online thing or, a cooking class or something, whatever. But it doesn't only, happen inside of a state public school building. Right. So, helping people break from that mold and to think that learning is something that happens serendipitously everywhere, I think is a big first step is to, breaking out of that kind of trope and that kind of, fixation on this is the only way you're going to be educated. Right. Yeah. So what types of, I guess you say common criticisms have you gotten with your book when people try to say, oh, well, what do you know about, school or stuff like that? And, sometimes I get like the, oh, do you have kids thing? Like, so what type of, criticisms are often, thrown at you when you try to talk to people about this?
That's a really good question. I think most of the criticisms, if you go and you read the reviews of my book, most of the criticisms on there are from people that have not read my book, that were making comments about me as a person, that they were not really a big fan of me because I did not agree with the coercive practice of forcing people to mask and vaccinate. So that's probably been my biggest criticism, is that they don't like me as an individual because I don't believe that human beings should coerce other human beings to do anything. So yeah, that's probably been the biggest thing. From people that have actually read my book, I think it is one of those things that it's challenging. It's like you're seeing the world through this whole new lens, and we're starting to kind of peel back those layers of why are we doing this? Why is this way? And like, what can we do different, right? For me personally, when I first started learning about unschooling, it was terrifying. I was absolutely terrified that I was going to be the only reading teacher with a child that did not know how to read, because that was my fear was, oh my gosh, if I don't teach her, how can kids learn to read if you don't teach them, right? And I kind of felt like my whole career was a lie. I'd spent all these years teaching children how to read, and yet I was hearing all these unschoolers tell me that kids were just learning how to read naturally all on their own. But I had to see it for myself. And so I kind of experimented on my own daughter. And when she was 5, I was like, you know what, we're going to try this just for 1 year. We're going to not have any I'm not going to buy any curriculum. We're not going to do any formal learning. It's kindergarten. I know I can't mess her up too bad. I can always go back and teach her, letters and numbers and all that stuff. I know how to do all that. But we just gave it a try for a year. Said we'll give it a try and see how it goes. And so that's what I encourage parents to do now. If kind of jumping off that ship for the rest of your life feels very intimidating, don't view it as like a long-term commitment. Just give it a try. I encourage people to try it for a year and really like let go of anything that looks like school. Like literally live your life as though school does not exist for 1 year, and you'll be amazed at what your children and you guys create for your lives.
Yeah, it is kind of incredible that people don't realize that just natural curiosity with kids and they're wanting to explore the world leads to those teachable moments, those, learning opportunities, whether it's just, hey, could you read me a book, mommy or daddy, whatever. and then you're like, oh, okay, you're just sitting together, holding them, and reading a story to them. I mean, it's an opportunity to like visualize the words, hear the sounds, and things like that. So these learning opportunities are everywhere if people just are open to the idea of, okay, just be ready to talk with your child and to encourage them in the moment of interest. I mean, it's what it boils down to, is just acting as a facilitator instead of performance judge, where you have to be like, oh, I got to do this at this time. If you don't, you're getting an F, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and it really removes a lot of that stress and that tension from our relationship, because I can't even imagine trying. And I know a lot of parents have that fear of like, oh my gosh, I can't make my kid do their homework after school. How am I supposed to force them to sit all day and do these 8 different subjects that I don't know, all day long? And it feels overwhelming and stressful and miserable. And with unschooling, it's just not that at all. It's literally complete freedom and joy, and as much for my children as it is for me, because I'm getting to join them in their passions and join them in the things that they love and the things that they're creating. And just as an update, my daughter actually did learn how to read. She taught herself how to read all by herself. It was absolutely amazing to watch. And she's actually working on publishing her 4th book right now. And
wow.
She's 8 years old.
That's awesome to hear. That's fantastic. I know some people will say too, they'll say, well, you were a teacher or you have all experience, I'm not as experienced, and things like that. And I think, those types of criticisms, and I'd like to hear as well your thoughts on this too, can be readily met with the idea that you don't have to be perfect in order to learn. You just have to be open to finding resources. That's about it. If there's anything you're ever, not sure of, then okay, that's okay. As an adult, there's nothing wrong with that. You can also be a self-directed learner and say, okay, let me go to library, or let me go look up on YouTube or something like that, find a video that's interesting that maybe can do it better than I can. You don't have to know and be everything.
Right. Exactly. And it's not that unschoolers aren't taking formal classes. I think the difference is that the children are choosing those things. So like my daughter went through a period that she was really interested in coding and wanted to learn more about coding. I don't know the first thing about coding. So I had to do that. I had to go and see, okay, how can we learn about coding? And we ended up getting an app for her iPad. And then she also took a class. And then in the end, she decided that she didn't like working with a teacher because she wanted to go at her own pace and she could go faster than the teacher was teaching. And so she just continued learning on her own. And so, your kids can figure out what works for them and how they learn best. But I love the way that you said that a big part of our job is providing them with those resources and supporting them and really kind of filling that supportive role for them. But they're really the ones that are in the driver's seat of their own learning.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree there too. And just reminding people that unschooling does not mean no textbooks ever, or you could never join a class, or it's just supposed to be that a young person has a meaningful opportunity to choose their learning. And if there is a class they want to take, there's nothing wrong with that. If a guy's like, I want to take a painting class, or as you said, I want to take a coding class and test it out, or they want to take, a class because they're preparing to possibly do the college path thing. I mean, it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as the young person is able to actually meaningfully choose and decide, okay, this is something that I would like to try out and test out.
Absolutely. And when our children have that option to choose, I find that they learn so much faster and so much easier than if we try to force and coerce them to learn things and they're not ready, they're not interested, it has no value for them. But if we can just kind of set aside all those things, set aside our own expectations, our own ideas of what they should be doing or where they should be in their learning, if we can set aside the should, I think we'd be very surprised to see that when they're ready, they're going to pick it up so much faster than if we try to force them to do it in the moment, and it's just miserable for both of us,
Well, yeah, and that good point about the feeling stressed and the misery of trying to force things and having these expectations of when something must happen, that ends up creating a big shaming complex too for parent and the kid. And obviously, I've seen this plenty of times within the schooling context of parents yelling at their kids, threatening them, taking away stuff because they got a B instead of an A or a C instead of whatever, or maybe they failed the test or whatever. And then these parents are screaming at them, sometimes even hitting their kids, which is horrific. But it's real. It happens. And being able to say, hey, you not only do you not need these means in order to help your child learn, but you actually can have really good conversations instead and have emotional connection instead of disconnection, isolation. I think that's a pretty powerful message to offer parents, that this is not simply something that, helps your child be able to feel less stressed, but you'll also feel less stressed and have a better relationship in the process.
Mm-hmm. And when I encourage, so now I help parents transition from public school to homeschool, or specifically to unschooling. And that's one of the things that I advise all of my parents to do. Literally live like school does not exist and simply focus on having a connected, positive relationship with your child, whatever that looks like, and really observe them. That was one of the biggest shifts for me was, I know you made the comment of people will look at me and say, oh, you could do this because you're a teacher, but it's because I'm a teacher that I think it was so hard for me to do this, to let go of my preconceived ideas. And at the same time, I knew what the teacher in me would do. And so I was very intentional to say, I am not going to do any of my teacher tactics. I'm not going to do any of these things that I have learned in my teaching career. I'm going to take off my teacher hat and I'm going to become a student of my child. And that's all I'm going to focus on. I'm going to observe her. I'm going to play with her. I'm going to see, what is she interested in? What does she naturally gravitate towards? What are her strengths? What is she engaged in? What questions is she asking? What problems does she want to solve? And then see how I can help support her in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I really love how you encapsulate that and just remind people that this is just a whole different paradigm shift, a whole different way of thinking. And instead of it being, a stressful thing where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to, do this or that, or, they're not on time or on track. You could actually just really live in the moment. You can actually just be like, nothing else matters. I'm just going to enjoy this time reading to them or watching a YouTube video with them or whatever it is. You don't have to feel stressed like you're not getting enough done in time. I think that's a beautiful thing. One of the things that often comes up with this, though, that people try to criticize about, and they're bring up their own traumas and projecting that, is they'll say, well, what about discipline, and what about these little brats? They're going to grow up and they're going to be all disobedient and things like that. How do you respond to people who bring those types of things up and just say, you're just going to create a bunch of entitled, spoiled brats, and that's why this generation is the way they are. They've been spanked enough, that kind of thing.
Oh my goodness, I love that one.
Right.
I have to remind people all the time, peaceful parenting is not permissive parenting. We're not letting children just walk all over us. And I think it comes back to a fundamental misunderstanding of what the word discipline means. It's actually the very first book that I ever wrote is a book called Gospel-Based Parenting, a biblical study on discipline and discipling. And that book is available on Amazon if you're interested. But with that book, it basically was sharing my journey of, as a Christian, and how I came to become a gentle parent and began to see these principles of gentle parenting as the true way to biblically discipline our children. And it comes down to understanding that definition of discipline. So the word discipline actually means to teach or instruct. It does not mean to punish. Punishment is something that is very distinct from discipline. But in our minds, when we hear someone say, oh, you need to discipline their kids, what they're really saying is you need to punish your kids. But that's not what discipline is. Discipline simply means teaching and instruction. And there are tons of ways that we teach and instruct our children that does not involve or need to involve violence, threats, humiliation, coercion, isolation, all of those other things that we know cause harm. We can teach them through modeling. We teach them through serving them, through giving them opportunities, all of these other ways, loving our children, being patient with them, showing compassion and empathy. And so, yeah, that's how we discipline them.
Right. And I think a lot of people make that misconception. They're like, oh, well, world schooling or unschooling, whatever, that's unparenting. Right. That's not the case. Right. It doesn't mean you sit there and say, oh, you want to try rat poison today? Sure. Go ahead and get rat poison. Right. You still set healthy boundaries. You specifically look out for things that are addictive or physically harmful. You don't just let them say, yeah, I'm going to play with the socket. And you say, you use restraint. But instead of hitting them, you talk to them. And if they're unable to understand talk, then they're also unable to understand the hitting portion and what you're trying to supposedly communicate there, through hitting and just causing pain and trauma, so that they're just fear, based now, and they're just reacting. So I think that's something that is often missed out because too many people just want to chalk it up to, well, if I don't hit them, then they're just gonna, do whatever. But obviously, if spanking literally solved all the world's problems, then right, it's like nobody would ever be a criminal ever, right? Because most people got spanked for most of history, this and that, right? But yet, despite the spanking, kids still do stuff again. They still, will grow up to do other, types of things that might be hurtful to others, right? The spanking in itself doesn't resolve the rest of someone's psychology and their moral philosophy and their emotional self-regulation. It's just, adds more pain and trauma without having the connected conversations, without learning about why they're feeling the way they're feeling and what they're doing and why. So, it's one of those things that it can be tough to break people out of. So I'm really appreciative that you took the time to add that into your work and to educate other people on that. So
yeah, it is challenging. I think for a lot of parents, they see, well, spanking works, right? That's the big thing I hear a lot. Spanking works. And I think we really, again, need to start peeling back those layers. What is it that is working? Because you can coerce temporary compliance, but from my perspective, I don't want my child to obey me because they're afraid of me. I want my child to obey me in the sense of that she's considering my opinion as something valuable because she trusts me and she knows that I love her and that I have her best interest at heart. But it's a completely different paradigm shift when we look at children as, I'm going to force and coerce your obedience and pretend like I have a well-disciplined child, when in actuality, the real win is being able to have a child that is able to make decisions and communicate and problem solve and interact with you in a real authentic way, and they're willing to obey, quote unquote obey, because they love you and they trust you, not out of fear.
Right. I like Dr. Murray Strauss, who wrote the book The Primordial Violence, his framing and his research that when it comes to spanking and hitting and things like that, if a kid does something again, they don't say, well, spanking's failed, the kid did it again, right? They just like, oh, I got to hit him harder next time, But it's the same type of mentality that applies to peaceful parenting tactics. Just because they didn't get the first time doesn't mean they'll never get it. What matters is being consistent in how you treat a child and how you use empathy and restraint to not escalate the situation, and continue to use those practices so you develop empathy and mirroring within a child, instead of just, oh, okay, the same hand that's supposed to love you and protect you is also going to hit you and cause fear and trauma. And so it really is something that takes time, I think, to overcome those past habits of behavior, and for a lot of people to actually consider what it means to help a child become a greater critical thinker and more emotionally well-regulated based on their own intrinsic motivation and conversation and understanding the world, around them. As opposed to just, oh, okay, if someone's, 3 times bigger than me, they hit me, I better just obey,
Yeah, but it's a lot harder though. Like for me, the easy way out is, oh, you just hit them and terrify them and bully them into forced compliance, right? But it takes longer and more patience and more self-control on my part to be able to not do that, and to be able to have a conversation and explain things and take my time to help them understand and process and dialogue and all of those kinds of things. So it is a huge shift for parents, but it's an important one that I think we all need to invest the time and energy into cultivating that.
And I think one story you mentioned was the Cheerios story. Was that
yes.
Right? I thought that was a good example, of that idea of missing the communication, missing the understanding. Could you, if you wouldn't mind, relate a little bit of that story so people kind of have something to connect this to with a specific example?
Yes. So with my daughter, she was around 18 months old, and she was eating some Cheerios and she had thrown some on the floor, and I asked her to clean them up, and she said no. And this was the very first time that my daughter had ever said no to me. And I was kind of like, what do you mean no? What are you talking about? So I asked her again to clean it up, and again she said no. And I was like totally baffled and thrown off, wasn't sure how to handle it. And so we kind of went into this power struggle back and forth of clean up the Cheerios, no, clean up the Cheerios, no. And so I called my sister, my older sister, she has 4 kids. I figured she would know what to do. And she suggested putting my daughter in timeout. And so that's what I did. I put her in timeout, and all right, here we go. Now timeout's done. We're going to clean up the Cheerios. No. And we went back and forth like this for literally half an hour. Both of us were crying. It was absolutely miserable. And then I just talked with her and I said, do you need some help? And she said, yes. And I asked her if she knew where to put the Cheerios, and she said no. And it became very clear to me that I was asking her to do something that she literally just didn't know what to do. She wasn't trying to be defiant or disrespectful or anything like that. She legitimately didn't know what I meant when I said clean up the Cheerios. I was just giving her this command, and she didn't know what to do with it. And so I showed her, okay, we're going to pick up the Cheerios and we're going to put them in this trash can over here. We had a trash compactor. And I remembered, okay, my gentle parenting, we're going to try to turn this into a game. So I asked her if we could do it cheetah speed. And literally, I mean, in a moment, it went from this power struggle of me versus her, and I'm angry and she's, buckling down and we're both upset, crying and miserable, to now we're running back and forth, and I'm helping her clean the Cheerios up, and we're laughing and on the floor laughing together with all these Cheerios all around. And it was like this moment of, something that could have been this terrible power struggle between the two of us, if I would have just taken the time to explain and to be clear and to teach her, again, the discipline piece, to discipline her and teach her, this is how we clean up our Cheerios. I could have avoided the whole half an hour fiasco that we both experienced in that moment. And after that, that was the last time I ever put my daughter in timeout. I apologized to her for isolating her, and she actually later, I didn't include this in the book, but later she told me that it really hurt her that I made her sit away from me and facing the wall. And so I apologized to her for doing that to her and isolating her. But it's just a simple thing. If we can be clear in our communication and understanding and show empathy, it can avoid a lot of those, the power struggles. It's not me versus you. It's us versus some problem. And we can work together to figure out how to solve the problem.
I really like your framing there and that example, because I think it points to this idea that when it comes to kids, that it can be easy to fall into this trap of just, shaming and command and control and blaming, because that's often what's been modeled for, most people in their lives, is just being told what to do, when to do it. And if you don't do it quick enough, there's something wrong with you, right? There's no investigation past that point to see what's going on for the person. So being able to actually have that opportunity to reflect and to remind everybody that kids have things going on upstairs for them too. Like, they have things going in their lives, and ask them, why do you feel the way you feel? Oh, why do you think that? And to, get a conversation going, not only helps them become better critical thinkers and, self-reflective, but it also helps parents, stop commanding and shaming and labeling, onto kids, and creating expectations in their minds that are inherently going to be broken, because we're, parents thinking, or whoever's, taking care of a kid's thinking, they're not in the same level as the kids and what they're focused on in the moment. And so bridging that gap, building understanding, does a lot more to help kids relate and have empathy and reciprocity in a relationship than just being like, well, okay, well, too bad, turn around, sit in the corner, or I'm going to hit you, that kind of thing. Right. That doesn't breed any more connection or any more understanding or love or affirmation. So, it's
trust as well. It really breaks that trust in the relationship. And for me as a parent, that's one of the most important things. I had a conversation with my daughter the other day about this. She came running into me, and I could hear my son. I have a son now, he's 4 and my daughter's 8. I could hear them kind of like fighting in the background. And my daughter came running in and was like, Mom, don't listen to him. He's just trying to get me in trouble. And I looked at her and I said, Sophia, are you worried about being in trouble with me? And she kind of thought for a second, and she was like, well, actually, no. And I was like, that's good. And why aren't you worried about being in trouble with me? And she was like, because I know you're here to help. And so that was just such a powerful moment for me. Like, I could never say that of my parents. Like, I was always afraid of being in trouble with them. But I'm so thankful that my daughter doesn't have that fear, that she knows that I'm a safe person that she can come to when she's having a problem. And, I know a lot of people bring up the whole disobedience thing too, of they're worried about their kids being disobedient. And I tell people all the time, I'm not worried about disobedience, because my goal for my child isn't obedience to me. In fact, I very rarely issue commands, because I'm not the dictator of my home. I try my best to give her choices and freedom and the opportunity to practice making her own choices, because I know one day they're not going to be under my roof making choices. And so it's important that we can give our children those opportunities to make choices for their own life and to help them process the choices that they're making while they're little. And I think that applies not only to parenting, but also when it comes to their education.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree there. Just the idea of creating a peaceable home with communication, it builds that trust, and it becomes less about this focus of the power struggle you're talking about, where it's like, oh, the goal here should be to obey me no matter what. It's like that's not my goal, at least from my background in terms of philosophy of voluntarist. My goal is that the kids are going to be respectful of their bodies and each other, that they're going to respect each other's bodily property rights, physical property rights, and
Mhm.
are self-aware enough that they take care of themselves and respect consent and respect others in that way, out of wanting mutual respect of their own consent to their own bodies and things like that. Not
Yeah.
obedience is definitely not the end goal. It's supposed to be taking care of oneself, being conscious of others and their property, their bodies, and and respecting consent, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I think that's an absolutely great framing there, that you're talking about with your kids and being able to build that with them.
Mhm.
So when it comes to your work now, you had mentioned before that you have a type of educational program in terms of helping parents leave the school paradigm and the paradigm of violence, threat, shame, and coercion. Could you tell everybody here a little bit more, as we're getting close to the end here, just what it is that you offer and how people can connect with you, if there's anybody here who's looking to get more knowledgeable on these topics through your resources and learning about world schooling and so on and so forth?
Yes. Thank you for asking. I am a certified PMA advisor. I'm not sure if you're familiar with PMAs, but that is a private membership association, and this is a way for us to conduct our businesses, our homeschooling, our churches, our families, our lives in the private domain, completely free from government rules and regulations. And so that is what I do now. I help families create PMAs for their businesses and for their homeschooling so that they're not having to be subject to these ridiculous rules and demands that government has, and we can operate in the freedom that God intended for us to walk in all along. And I believe that our rights are given to us by God, and that those rights are protected by our Constitution. And so that's what I do. I offer free consultations for parents, and I'm an author. I'm offering several courses as well. Most of them are for free. And I also have a podcast. So I have the Peaceful World Schooling podcast. If you're interested in learning more or in being a guest and you want to come on my show and talk about gentle parenting and unschooling, I would be more than happy to have you. And so, yeah, the Peaceful World Schooling podcast. And feel free to, follow me on social media. I love to share, videos and posts and stuff that will encourage you and inspire you on your journey to be a peaceful person, both in your home and in the world.
Awesome. And for those interested in picking up your book, is that just on Amazon, or is it any other place as well?
Yes, you can purchase the book on Amazon, or if you would like a signed copy, you can order that through my website, www.peacefulworldschoolers.com.
Awesome. And before we go here, would you mind just sharing who maybe your top two inspirations in this realm have been, in terms of who you really look up to in the peaceful parenting, world schooling, self-directed education movement?
Yes. John Taylor Gatto for sure has been one of my heroes. I tell people all the time, I want to be the John Taylor Gatto of my generation. Just another teacher that encouraged parents and children to be free. And David Rodriguez, actually.
Oh, there you go. Okay, for us for a second. There we go. Yeah. So David Rodriguez, John Taylor Gatto. That's two great people. I love both their work as well. Definitely great people to check out. So again, thank you so much, Angela, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us and your own experiences. I especially appreciate it, having been through that rodeo, teaching in public schools and seeing it firsthand, and understand how crazy it really is out there and how toxic it is of an environment for children to be in. So thank you so much for your work, helping to get families out and helping to show people that there is a sensible path to leading this. So you don't need to rely on the old tools of coercion and threats and ultimatums in order to have deep, meaningful learning experiences and connections. So really appreciate you, and hopefully be able to talk more in the future, especially about an update to your work and anything else you're doing. So
That would be great. Thank you so very much, Jack, for having me.
of course. Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Well, take care, everybody. I'm not sure exactly when the next interview will be, but we'll be doing another ZeroState sometime soon. And I'll be going on a show just a little bit after this, actually, for the Libertarian Christians. See, they're doing an interview with me just about 30 minutes after this. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, and I'll talk to y'all later. So take care, everybody. Thanks for coming on.
Bye.
ZeroState with Jack Lloyd.